Okay, today we're talking about Hameshus Mini Dagan. It's going to only be part one. I'm going to talk more about background. Maybe you'll think everything I say is very obvious and straightforward, but it's a prep for next time. I'm going to talk about some of the more contentious applications. Okay, so the Hameshus Mini Dagan, wheat, spelt, barley, oats, and rye, have special properties to them. Okay, and the Torah says the reason is because two reasons. One is because they're part of the Shivas Aminim. So even though the Torah really says Chita and Soira, it only has two of them, but Kusmin, which is spelt, is considered part of Chita, and Sheboil Shul is oats, and Shipun, which is rye, are considered part of Soira. So the Torah says the two reasons why the Chameshis Min Dagan are special. One is because they're part of the Shivas Aminim, and the other is because they give special amount of nutrition and sustenance more than other foods do. That's from the Gemara, and therefore they have these special rules to them. So, for example, we do only hafrashas challah from those chamishas min dagan. You only need the rules of pas Yisrael only include things that are from those chamishas min dagan. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today we're talking about the berachos aspect of it. Okay, so in order to talk about it, I have to first tell you, maybe I'll say I'll bore you, with how the way you process these grains, just to eat them as grains, okay? And this is our only picture for today. No? Okay. The grains, we're going to talk Hameshis Min Dagan. Most other grains are the same also, but Hameshis Min Dagan, they have 4 parts to the grain. Okay? The grain really is a seed, okay? Meaning it's the thing that if it went into the ground, it would grow into the plant, into next year's plants. And of the 4 parts, the part that's called the germ is a small little part on the bottom. I forgot the percentage, how big it is, a small part of the thing. And that's the part that will actually grow. That's the actual part that's going to grow. Around it is the bulkiest part. It's called the endosperm. It's basically starch. It has some other things also, but basically it's starch. And that's what's going to give fuel to the germ so that it could grow for the beginning until it's self-sufficient. Okay, until there's a leaf coming out of the top and roots coming out of the bottom, until it's self-sufficient, the endosperm is what it needs to keep it going till it's ready to be on its own. Okay, around that is bran. Bran, it's a very thin layer around it. The bran has vitamins in it and protein in it that are also beneficial somehow to help the thing grow, to help the germ grow. And around all of that, all of that is the husk. Is an outer coating, an outer layer on the outside, which has nothing to do with the growth. Okay, the husk doesn't give any kind of nutrition at all to people. I mean, to animals maybe. For people, it doesn't give any kind of nutrition. And Mamela, you always take husk off for people. Okay, nobody eats that off. Nobody eats food that has husk in it. Okay, so if you take off the husk, is 2 melachos on Shabbos. For your curiosity, if you take the husk off, that's considered a whole grain. Okay, hagam that it's not, so to speak, whole, but it's considered the whole grain. It's the whole part that a human could eat. It would be the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. That's considered a whole grain. Okay. Now let's go to. I'm going to break down into the different grains themselves. Okay. It's very difficult to get, for whatever reason, it's difficult to get the bran off of oats. So all oats are whole oats. Okay, the whole oats mean I don't mean complete. I mean whole, as in they have all the parts in it: the germ and the endosperm and the bran. Everything, all oats are whole oats. And if you take an oat by itself, just the oat grain. Next time I have samples for you to show you. When you have the whole oat grain, it's called a groat. Okay, for whatever reason. Okay, you could use them groats as is, but usually they're either rolled, they literally roll them out to flatten them out to make rolled oats. Or sometimes they're cut or broken up into pieces, into smaller pieces also. Okay, like steel cut oats are groats that are broken into smaller pieces. Okay, now most grains, besides for oats, as soon as you get them dried out, they dried it to whatever percentage, 13%, you get them to the right amount of dryness, they'll last forever. Okay, they'll just sit in the soil, they can last for a million years. But oats are not like that. Oats have more fat and lipase, which is an enzyme that digests fat, in them than other grains. And if you leave them by themselves, they will turn rancid. And memela, they have to be heat treated to deactivate that enzyme before they're put away for storage. Okay, which has applications for Pesach. I'm going to mention in a second. Okay, so it's oats is different than all the other ones that it gets heat treated. All the rest of them don't have to be heat treated. They just get dried out, and once they're dried, they're good to go. They'll last for a million years. Okay, that's oats. I'm telling you a little more than you need to know, but I'm trying to give you details that are going to be relevant as we go on.
But wheat, even though it's dry, if it gets wet again, it could be machmetz.
Of course, yeah, of course. Good. I'm just looking at. Right now just say to storage. Okay. Barley. Now we move to barley. All the grains, give or take, look the same, and there's going to be no more pictures today. I'm sorry. Okay, you just stuck with that. Next time we have fun pictures. Okay, barley. You can buy barley in 3 forms. Okay, you could buy hulled, pot, or pearled barley. Okay, hulled barley is, as they say, kishmoy kenhu. It's barley that they just took off the hull. Everything else is complete. It's literally the whole grain. They just took off the hull. Okay. The hull is the husk. The husk. I'm sorry. Yeah, I should have translated that. Yes, the hull and the husk is the same thing. So it's hulled means that's all he did is took off the hull. Okay, or some people say dehulled. I guess it depends which part of the world you live in. Okay. Anyhow, of course, a little bit of bran comes off possibly with it, but basically you're getting the whole barley. Okay, pot and pearl barley both went through a machine called a pearling machine. Okay, which basically just scrapes off parts of the bran. When you do pot barley, you take off just a little bit of the bran. Okay, and so it still keeps some of its original. You can still see bran on the outside of the thing, a certain amount of it, which has a yellowish color. And pearl barley, you've taken off almost all the bran. Okay, and makes it smaller, changes the color of it also. And usually what you buy in the supermarket is pearl barley. That's what's more typical. If you go home, if you're making challah, not like us gluten-free, if you make a regular challah with barley in it, you'll see it's going to be pearl barley, okay? Not so common to have pot barley. Mitzvah Hashem, you'll see it next week. Okay. Now, whole barley is a whole grain. The other ones are not. Okay, to be a whole grain, you have to have the bran on also. So whole barley's got bran, it's got everything. As opposed to pot barley or pearl barley, I'm not going to.
Suffix that maybe our barley.
Next time, I'm going to explain to you. Next time,
our barley is whole barley.
I'm going to explain to you.
Does he not mean our barley?
Yeah, see, next time I'm going to show it to you with samples to explain to you what that Mishnah is talking. Okay, I have my sample. I have toys, but it's for next time. Okay. I know. I'm sorry that today is just a prep for tomorrow. For next time. Okay. Now wheat, rye, and spelt. So those are the first 2 of the grains. Wheat, rye, and spelt are processed basically the same way, okay? And that is, you take off the hull, and then there's 2 things you could do with them. You have 2 choices. The most common thing they do is they take off the bran, leaving just the endosperm. Sometimes the germ gets taken out with the bran also, and they grind up the endosperm and make you flour, okay? Sometimes the germ gets into there also. It's people don't like that as much, it spoils quicker, but sometimes they keep it in, but they grind up the endosperm, and that's called flour. We call that white flour, okay, because it's just white, because the endosperm is white. It's just starch. Basically, it's just starch, okay? The other choice is...
They take off the bran and then they grind it.
They take off the bran.
And they never grind it and sift it out.
They do. No, yes, that's correct. No, they do. They grind it. No, you're right. They don't take the bran off. They grind it with the bran together, but then it gets sifted away to remove the bran from it. Yes, correct. They don't. It's not like pearling that you scrape off the bran. You grind it all together. The bran ends up being bigger pieces, and it gets sifted out.
These are which species?
Wheat, spelt, and rye.
Wheat, spelt, and rye.
Yes. Okay.
What the Gemara calls subin, is that with the husk?
That's husk.
That's husk.
Well, that's a machlokes, whether it's husk or bran or another one of the layers that's in there. Okay. So the other choices you can make what they make called brown whole wheat flour, which is brown. Okay, and it's brown. Whole wheat flour is because they leave bran inside of it. So it makes a whole wheat flour because it's the whole thing. As long as you took off the husk, it includes bran in it. That's called whole wheat flour. Okay, the traditional way to make whole wheat flour was to do what I just told you, to grind it all up and then keep all the pieces in together. Nowadays, mills, a lot of them do what's called recombination method. You may have heard about this, the recombination method, which is they basically make everything into white flour. They make everything into white flour. They separate the bran from it. And then when someone calls in an order and says, hi, I need a truckload of whole wheat, they say, okay, and they mix bran back in. They recombine it to make this into a whole wheat flour. And then you can tell how much you want. You could say, I want this much percent bran, or more bran, or less bran, to make it how you want your thing to be.
So any whole wheat that they're selling by percentage, 20, 80% whole wheat, whatever that is, it means because they
No, it doesn't. Sometimes it means it's how much they take out. Okay, sometimes
they can measure that. Because once you're sifting it out,
of course you can, because you sift as much as you want to sift. Okay, you take as much as you want to. You could sift finer or less fine. It's how much you want to take out. So it depends. But most big places that are doing flour are doing the recombination, which is that everything gets completely separated. Okay, they take the bran out of everything, and then depending on orders, they'll put bran back in to make the person get what he wants.
The bran could be produced at a different time than the other stuff.
Yeah, you don't necessarily get the bran from your original flour.
So are there chadash issues between the bran if it's like stored separately at a different time?
That's a good question. I don't know. Okay, the one difference between wheat and the other two, and spelt and rye, is that wheat is tempered. In order you moisten wheat kernels a certain amount, a very small amount of moisture is put onto them. It's called lasisa. In Lashon Kodesh, we call it lasisa. You put a small amount of moisture on it, it helps the bran come off better. When you're doing the grinding, it'll help the bran come off better. So lasisa gets done to
What is it called?
tempering in English, or in Lashon Kodesh, we call it lasisa. Lasisa. And so the Gemara says you're allowed to do midaraisa. You're allowed to do lasisa in the Beis Hamikdash. They did lasisa to the grains, even though you're not allowed to have chametz in Beis Hamikdash. We nowadays do not consider ourselves capable of doing lasisa without making it chametz. Okay, but rye and spelt do not have lasisa on them. They're not tempered.
You do that after you take off the husk. That's what you do.
Sorry, what's the definition of tempered?
Temper. You just moisten it a drop. That's what I just said. You just put a tiny bit of moisture on a very, very controlled tiny bit of moisture put onto it, and that helps. The bran absorbs that moisture, makes it easier to separate.
Is it always done cold, or is there?
Yes, cold. Okay, two other things about grains. You could buy grains. It's called middlings. Okay, to pet foods, which is middlings is a smaller pieces of. I'm sorry, bigger pieces that are bigger than flour, but smaller than whole grains. It's usually animal food. It's in pet foods, and also sprouted grains. You've probably heard of that. A sprouted grain means you take a grain, and usually most commonly it's barley. Take the grain, put it into water in warm water. The grain says, "Oh, it's time to grow." Right now, I'm ready to grow. Obviously, the conditions are right. It starts to grow. It releases enzymes to start breaking down the starch into a sugar that the germ could use to live on. Okay, and then what you've now broken down that starch into sugar, it has a sweet taste to it. Okay, the plant thought it was starting to grow, and that's called malt. Okay, if it's barley, it's called malt. That's you probably heard of that, like for making beer and for making flavorings and things like that. That's malt. That's to sprout. Great. A malted milk. It has malt in it, correct? Or you may have heard of it. We'll talk about it one day in Mirz Hashem, to make like Ezekiel bread, okay, which is a sprouted grain. You could sprout any grain. You don't have to only sprout that. And then you sprout those, and then whatever reason, somehow that's magical and that tastes good. Okay.
Will you be talking about berachos for Ezekiel bread?
Yeah. Two questions for Ezekiel bread. Yes. Okay. So we're going to talk about, after this very long introduction, we're going to talk about the berachos part. I'm going to mention quickly 4 other things that what I just told you is mentioned for 4.5. Okay, one is the ones that are not made wet. Okay, like barley or rye and spelt, they're not made wet, are not chametz. Okay, because they never got wet. It's just the grain. They never got wet. They're not chametz. Related to that is they never get wet, then they're not hochshel l'kabel tumah, which means is that if you want to make something out of it, particularly if you want to make matzah, egg matzah for Pesach, and you don't use water in your recipe, you have shilas about hafrashas challah. Okay, because the challah that you're going to separate is not going to be challah that's tamei, because it was never hochshel l'kabel tumah. Okay, I'm going to just do it quickly. What? It's very for real. If you make egg matzah, it's a for real shilah. Okay, the amount of flour you do hafrashas challah is a shilah. We talked about this when we learned hafrashas challah about if you use the recombination method, you separate the bran. The Shulchan Aruch says if you add bran into a flour, it doesn't count towards a shehakol. So it's a question whether that's true, even the way we do recombination. The shilas and poskim, we spoke about this also. when we did Hagol's Kalim, for whatever reason, about whether the bran can become chametz. Okay, whether that layer called bran can become chametz or not, or maybe. Sorry about that. Or whether only or only maybe the end. I know my computer rings. Sorry. Or whether only the endosperm could become chametz. Okay, that's a to-do. We spoke about that also, and then in Yashan, spelt, rye, and winter wheat are always planted in the fall, and then they're harvested after Pesach, so they're always Yashan. Just because the way they grow, they're always planted before the winter, and they're harvested after Pesach, so they're always Yashan, as opposed to oats and barley and spring wheat, which is used for like fluffy foods like bread, and durum wheat, which is used for like pasta. Those are planted in the spring, and those are the ones that potentially are chadash. Okay, those are all things we're not talking about. Okay. Now, onto the brachas parts of it. You could leave. I don't.
No, I want to hear.
Okay. Most people don't think about the fact that there are 4 possible brachas you could make when you eat grain. Okay, 4 possible brachas you can make. Okay, hadama, shehakol, hamotzi, or mezonos. Okay, I'm going to do them in that order. Okay, if you eat grain that's whole and that's not stuck to anything else, it gets the bracha is hadama. Okay, so for example, there's a kind of wheat that some people eat called farro, and you eat it cooked. You cook the whole. It's a whole grain usually. You eat it whole, and you cook it, and it usually does not. The pieces don't stick to each other. If they do stick to each other, we're going to talk about that next time.
Is that cream of wheat?
No, it's farro.
That has bran on the outside.
It has bran on it. Yes, it's usually whole grain, and people eat it like if you've eaten a plate of rice. That's how they eat this. It's like wheat and grows like that, and you eat it usually whole, and usually it doesn't stick together. And the bracha on that is hadama. Okay. Next time we're going to talk about what happens if they stick together. Okay. There's a to-do also. Ramosha talks about what bracha you make on puffed wheat. Okay, puffed wheat also, if you think about it, each piece of puffed wheat, or sugar crisp if you call it like that, puffed wheat is a whole piece of wheat. Okay, it's a whole piece. Now, Ramosha, when he talks about it, talks about it as if it has the bran on it also. Doesn't seem like most manufacturers actually do that. But if it were to be made from whole wheat, there's for sure one company that does that. But if you were to make it, then it would be an example of this, which is it's the whole grain. The pieces don't stick together. They got just a bunch of pieces of puffed wheat. And Ramesh says you make hadama because it's the whole grain, and the pieces are not stuck together. You make hadama. But in a sense, the fact that we make hadama on that thing, let's say on the puffed wheat of Ramesh or the farro, the fact that we make hadama is very similar to other grains. What happens if I eat a piece of corn or eat a potato or I eat something else that grows in the ground? What bracha do I make on it? I make hadama on it because when you eat something that grows in the ground, you make hadama on it. Okay, but so it's similar to that. You're making hadama and it grows in the ground. It's very similar to that, but it's not really the same. Okay, even though they both have the same bracha, that's not really the truth. Because really, the real bracha for making, for eating chameshes mini dagan, the real bracha is hamotzi mezonos, as we're going to talk about in a second. I mean, hamotzi is the real right bracha, and mezonos is the almost right bracha. Okay, but in fact, when the Gemara wants to talk about a person who eats a whole grain, it uses a really strange word. It doesn't say you were oichel a grain. It says you were kosis a grain. Okay, the word kosis, Rashi says, means is to eat something in an unusual way. Okay, if you eat it in an unusual way, and that it's unusual. So to eat corn is not unusual. Eat potatoes is not unusual. To eat grain whole is unusual. That's why I had to dig up and give you these funny cases of a guy who's eating farro or he's eating puffed wheat, because that's not the usual way you eat grain. You don't eat the chameshes mini dagan whole. That's not the normal way you eat them. So that the Rif explains like that. That the reason why we make hadama on the chameshes mini dagan when we eat them whole is because you're eating them in the not regular way. The real way to eat them would be like mezonos hamotzi kind of ways, which we could talk about in a second. If you eat them whole like this, the whole grain, and they don't stick together, that whole way of eating it, that for the chameshes mini dagan is considered unusual, and that's why you make hadam on it. Okay, so it's the same bracha as a potato, but it's not for the same reason. In potato, you're eating it the way you're, so to speak, supposed to eat it, and for the chameshes mini dagan, you're not supposed to eat like that.
So in that shehakol?
I'm coming to shehakol. Okay. Okay.
How do you spell Pharaoh?
Pei Reish Ayin Hey. No, I'm sorry. Farro. Okay. Now, if you take a grain and you mill it into flour, or even if you don't make it completely into flour, you make it into very small pieces that are close to flour, then that's really unusual, and then you make a shehakol on that. Okay, if you eat flour, you make a shehakol. There's another case where grain becomes shehakol. That's if you turn to a liquid. That's not for us. Okay, but if you if you make it into flour, you make a if you make it into flour, you make shehakol. Okay, now who eats flour? Okay, whoever eats flour, it's like a really strange thing. So the case that there is that seemed to me is relevant. You'll hear that not everybody thinks like me, but to me is what happens if a person were to eat straight wheat germ? Okay, most people don't do that. Most people when they eat wheat germ means they like to put it into their other foods. Then what I'm about to say is not relevant to that. I'm talking about what happens if a person literally eats straight wheat germ. Okay, they put it onto a spoon and they eat a whole spoonful of stuff. Okay, so what's the bracha on eating that? So what's wheat germ? It's the germ. Literally, it's the germ that they get out of the wheat. Okay, and it's milled not into the consistency of flour, but into a finer consistency, which is what it says. If you eat a grain by itself in flour or in a finer consistency, then the bracha on it is shehakol. Okay, so that's what I think. I think that's correct. I don't think it's hard for me to understand the other side. I'm going to tell you the other side in a second. But to me, it's an example.
Just the germ, or the germ, or the endosperm?
Wheat germ. That's all it is. It's just germ. That's all it is. You're getting just germ. Okay, and like this, the people, several contemporary firms say that the bracha on wheat germ is if you eat it straight is hadama. Okay, and they bring two sources for that. Two sources for why they say that. One is a Kaf HaChaim, and one is Igros Moshe. Okay? And now I'm going to tell you what those two sources say. They both say, everyone who says, go look at the Kaf HaChaim, and some of them say, and go look at Moshe also. Okay, and I'm going to tell you what the Kaf HaChaim says, and then you'll tell me if you think I'm right. Of course you can tell me I'm right.
Is there a case of people would eat it? I mean, usually they don't talk about shadows. Like nobody talks about eating flour. Nobody eats flour.
Right. I mean, Shulchan Aruch says it because it's a gemara, right? But wheat germ, there are people. Right, most people sprinkle wheat germ onto another food. They throw it into their soup. Okay, but there are people. If you eat, literally take a spoonful of it. Okay,
dry, just like
as is.
plain,
It's just like I got to get this down.
edible.
I got to get it down and I eat it. Okay,
It says
Healthy?
it's dangerous.
to eat it straight.
Yeah.
Why is it dangerous?
That's what it says.
Because.
I didn't look.
It may
Okay.
choke you or something.
Okay.
Flour, I think it's like you can choke on it.
Okay, so the Kaf HaChaim says this that he says this what the Kaf HaChaim is talking about. He says it comes from Rabbi Shaya Harishan. He says in Ksav Yad I have a Ksav Yad of Rabbi Shaya Harishan who says the following. Okay, Taka was a Ksav Yad those days. Nowadays we call that Piskei Rid. Okay,
It's a Trani.
correct. So Rabbi Shaya Harishan is who we call what we now call, and it's in print. It's called Piskei Rid. Okay, so. Piskei Rid, I'm going to tell you now three things that the Piskei Rid says. They're not in the same place. Okay, one is, he says, Kosher, like I told you, means is eating food in an unusual manner. That's what Kosher means. Like I told you, Rashi says, it means eat in an unusual manner. So he says, if Kosher means you eat in an unusual way, what happens if you eat other vegetable in an unusual way? Okay, I don't know if he gives this example, but one of the din is like this. What happens if I take a food that's usually you eat raw and I eat it cooked? Or it's usually eat cooked and they eat it raw. Okay, what's the din? Okay, let's say I take a potato. Potatoes usually eat cooked, and I eat it raw. What's the bracha on that? The bracha is shehakol. What happens if I eat a food that's usually eat raw and I eat it cooked instead? The bracha on it is shehakol also. Okay, I don't know if that's the example he gives, but his question is: if kosher means eat it unusual, how come if I eat a whole grain I make hadam on it? I should say I'm eating it in an unusual way. If I eat it in an unusual way, then the bracha should be shehakol. So why is the bracha hadama? Yeah, remember I told you, this is what Shmuel is. If I told you, kosher means eat it not regular. So we downgrade the bracha. Okay, usually when we downgrade the bracha, we go down to shehakol. Why are we going to hadama? Kosher is kasha. Taisus mentions it also, but Taisus is more clear about what it is. And it's relevant here because I'm trying to tell you Kaf HaChaim. Okay, he says the reason is because Demine Zroim Chashivi. Okay, there's a chashivas to the Chameshis Mina Dagon. So in other words, sort of, it's like everybody goes down one step. A regular food that's hadama goes down to shehakol. The chameshes mini dagan are more chashiv, so they're really mezonos or hamotzi. They go down to hadama. Okay, they go down one step. Okay, and so people say, okay, so everyone this second kafachan that I just told you is what people point to, and they say, see, it says in the Tosfos. See, it says in Tosfos Rid that if you eat something in an unusual way, you make hadam on it. Okay, you make hadam on it. So if I eat wheat germ, I'm eating it in an unusual way, so I should make hadam on it also. Okay, so the Piskei Rid says himself. He says there's an obvious question on what he just said. He just said is if you eat in an unusual way, you make hadama. So then why, if you eat flour, do you make shehakol? Okay, he just said that. Since the chashivi, therefore, if you eat them the unusual way, they get a higher bracha. They keep hadam. Okay, but the Gemara says that if you eat flour, it's a machlokes, but we're passing that if you eat flour, you make a shehakol on it. So what's going on? He asked the kasha himself.
Because it's dangerous.
That's not what he says. So that's what he said. So he says the Piskei Rid says like this. He says kivan de ishtani. In other words, we have a special chashivas to the chameshes mini dagan. They have some kind of special chashivas. When I take it, it's normal chameshes mini dagan. I didn't eat a whole grain. I made it even less than that. I cut it down to being flour. Now I sort of took away that whole chashivas that it had, and now it goes back to regular things that I make it into shehakol. Okay, so what is he telling us? He's telling us it's true that if you eat it in an unusual way, you make hadama. That's why if you eat a whole grain, you make hadama. But he says himself, in a different spot, the Piskei Rid says, if I eat it if I destroy it, then I make a shehakol on it. Okay, so basically and actually, if you look at the Kafachayim, after the Kafachayim brings, he says, I saw in Rabbi Shaya Rishon, he says, when you eat it unusual, you make hadama. He says, and then he says himself, he gives I forgot exactly what he says. He says, go look at the other halacha where it says about eating flour. In other words, that's the kasha that we're asking, which is what flour is different. So wheat germ and flour is the same thing.
So explain, how is it ishtani? What changed?
You took it from being a whole grain and you broke it down into just being a flour. Okay, you took away the chashivas that it had. It was a grain. It still at least held on to that. It was still a grain. When you turned it into flour, you even destroyed that. Okay. The Piskei Rid is explaining it, but it's really the Gemara says if you eat flour, you make shehakol. So he's just explaining what's going on over here. But okay, and then Ramosha, it's getting late. And then Ramosha is talking about eating wheat germ. That's Ramosha is actually talking about eating wheat germ. But Ramosha is not talking about a person who ate wheat germ straight. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a person who made hot cereal and he put wheat germ into it. Okay, he mixed wheat germ with honey and he made it into hot cereal. So of course the bracha there. And he says, that's how you make this thing. He considered that normal, so I don't think it had anything to do with it. Anyhow, so I don't think there's a right from there. You don't have to agree with me. I don't think it's right. Okay.
You don't think it's right from where?
I don't think the right from the Kafachayim or from Ramosha that you should, if you eat straight wheat germ, that you should make hadam. I think that it's exactly like flour and you should make shehakol on it. And the Kafachayim doesn't say what he
say that modern pricing that say from the Kafachayim is not you make hadam.
Correct. They point to the Kafachayim, and I'm telling you, the Kafachayim is coming from a Piskei Rid, and the Piskei Rid in a different place explains, but not everything is unusual. There's even worse than unusual, and that makes shehakol, which is really Gemara. That says flour, which is where I came from. But he tells you, he says, when you get it ground like that, it becomes even less than that and becomes shehakol, which is it's a Gemara. But the Piskei Rid, which is where he's coming from, is himself speaks it out.
Moshe says to make hadam.
What do you say?
Moshe says to make hadam.
Because he's not talking about eating.
Yeah, but once it was.
He talks about whether it's hadam or mezonos. That's not relevant. He talks about maybe it's hadam or mezonos on it. He talks about because it's not cooked. It's roasted. That's what he's talking about. You know?
But it wouldn't be hadam. It would either be mezonos or shehakol. Meaning, if it's normal to make that into a meichel, then it would be mezonos.
It's not cooked or it's hadam.
So that's his machlokes. So it's mezonos or hadam. That's what he's clear. So it's mezonos or hadam having to do with the way it's processed, whether it's cooked or if it's baked.
But if the way you're understanding it, that once it was flat and once it's broken down, it should be shehakol, and once that's out, it would be hadam.
Why should it possibly be hadam? I mean, what's the choice of hadam? It shouldn't be even on the table.
For wheat germ,
I don't remember. That's a fair question. I don't remember.
It's like granola. It's not cooked, so it's like
no,
clayus.
But over there it was kaisis. Granola would be considered kaisis that was never broken down to flour. But he's suggesting that once you make the wheat germ, you're breaking it down to flour, and it's shehakol.
So I'm not sure. And we're really not going to talk about granola. That's next time, okay?
That's the taste of sweet that says that's far. Who said Moshe is masking to that? You're saying it's broken down to losses Kashrus?
Okay, so then wheat germ would be hadam.
If you eat wheat germ in a way that's normal to eat it, if you do something to it that it's normal to eat, it's not like eating flour. That's totally. So then you make hadam.
If you mix flour, if you would mix flour into a cereal, that's a normal way to do it. Does it sound would be hadama?
Maybe.
Shehakol and mezonos.
Maybe.
So,
No, because if you make it into mezonos, it's mezonos. If you don't make it into mezonos, somehow you can eat flour, and it's not a mozon. It's not. You didn't make it whatever. It doesn't have the rules that makes it mezonos. And you make a normal way to eat the flour. Maybe it would be hadama.
No, it would be shehakol. Once you're nishtana and you make it into flour, so it's not going to become hadam again. It'll either become mezonos or stay shehakol.
This is the it says that's far. Who said Moshe's masking that's far?
Fine, but okay. So then again, we.
So we hold the reason why you make shehakol and flour is because it's
I have
completely
I
abnormal.
have no problem saying not a taste rid, but Rabbi Cohen is saying that wheat germ should be a shehakol. So I'm just saying, well, Chayyim Ramesha would be mavur, that would be hadama, because otherwise it wouldn't become hadama when you mix it into your cereal. So, like you're saying, Ramesha can't be going like the taste rid, but it can't become now a hadama. I don't think.
okay, I have to think about it. I can't think now. Okay, I still do two more things. Sorry. Two more brachos. Okay. Hamotzi. Okay, if you make pas out of the chameshes mina dagan, that's the real way you're supposed to use it, and you make hamotzi on that. The classic way you make bread is you take flour and water and yeast, and it makes a solid, fluffy item, and it has a pretty, if I'll use the word blandish taste to it, and that's what you make hamotzi on. Okay, there's a variation of that called pascal kistin, which has what the Gemara calls a turisa dinahamo, a place called tar lechem, or tzuras hapas. It has the same give or take appearance of bread, but there's something about it that's not the same as bread. Okay, there's something about it that's not as simple as a bread is, and that turns it into a snack.
And what's the translation?
I'm about to tell you. And the pasuk kissin means like it's pockets, but it means a snack food. And the Shulchan Aruch gives three examples of it. One is a cake. So in other words, there's something in it there's so much flavor. Think about a chocolate cake. It doesn't have a bland taste. So it has this very strong taste from something else, like the chocolate. Or a cracker. So it means something crunchy. That's not like bread-like, as much like a bread. Or a pie or a pizza where the dough part of it is pretty bread-like, but there's something on it that gives this adds this very strong taste to it. Okay, like you make pizza, it has this sauce and cheese on it, but the bread part of it is pretty simple. The bread part is just bread. Okay, so for those foods, if you make a meal of it, you make hamotzi, and if you don't make a meal of it, you make mezonos on. Okay, it's just in between, but it's a pas-like kind of a food.
What if it has garlic bread or something like that?
So it depends. If it has a very strong taste, there's the way the Rama says, if the other thing is the ikar, it becomes so overwhelming by this other taste, like a chocolate cake. The chocolate overwhelms the taste of the thing, then it becomes pasuk kissin.
Garlic bread is usually added after it's baked and was regular pas.
Mm-hmm. So that's a question, whether that makes a difference or not. Okay, fine. Last bracha is mezonos. You eat them in you take in a typical way. So you didn't make it hadam or shehakol, but you also didn't make them into a bread. So then you're making mezonos. So it didn't become pas, but it didn't become flour or whole or just a grain. It makes the Gemara calls that a kedairah, and the Gemara gives two examples of that. Excuse me. One is you make something like a porridge. Like for us, that would be like making farina or oatmeal or something like that. Okay, you make like a porridge out of it. So it doesn't. It's a kedairah. That's one thing you make a mezonos on. And the other example the Gemara gives is if you cut it up, cut into little pieces. The Gemara says for whatever, I don't know why it's like a thing. 2 pieces, 3, 4, or 5 pieces. The Gemara says all these examples. So those things all become those are mezonos. And Tosfos says another thing. He says I have another example. He says what happens if it doesn't have teresa dinahama? Like I make pasta out of it. Okay, so pasta is simple. It's just flour and water. But it doesn't have the tzuras hapas. That's another kind of example of something that would be all these things have.
It's cooked pasta because it's cooked.
That's not what Tosfos says. Tosfos says it's because it has teresa dinahama. Doesn't have teresa dinahama. That's what Tosfos says.
Is it with the tzaddik? With Teresa?
With a tough. It's tzura. In Hebrew we call it tzuras hapas.
Right.
Okay, so that's the Aramaic way of saying it. Tzuras hapas. It doesn't have the look of bread. Bread is this. You think of bread, you think of something that's fluffy and largish. Okay, when you talk about pasta, it doesn't have those properties at all. Okay, so that doesn't have.
It's totally machlokas if you hold sifkarim.
That's what I'm telling you. It's not because it's cooked. That's a separate machlokes. Whether cooked things, does cooking automatically disqualify you from being pas? That's not what Tosfos. Tosfos because it doesn't have tzuras pas.
So even if you
Shulshkanim have tzuras pas. Donuts are very much tzuras pas. It's just that the fact that they were cooked might disqualify
then
them.
you don't need to come on to Shurza Pass. I'm saying Tais only said that it's Shurza Pass because even if you hold that cooking could still be hamotzi, but in this
Maybe
case,
you could say that that's what Tosfos says, but whether it is or is not, I don't know. But that Tosfos, maybe he made lasagna and he baked it. He didn't cook it. I don't know.
I'm saying we don't know what Tais would say that doesn't have a Shurza Pass. Only maybe because it's cooked.
Tosfos says it doesn't have tzuras pas. It doesn't.
He's talking about something which is cooked.
He doesn't say what he's talking about.
He's talking about. He's not talking about
Pasta. But maybe he made his pasta like lasagna. I don't know what he did with it. I don't know. It doesn't talk about. It's not part of Tosfos' discussion.
Tais talks about pasta. What is that?
Yeah, vermaisha. What is it called?
It's cooked.
That's because in your house you cook the pasta. I don't know what this is.
He's not talking about in the context of it being cooked at all.
He
Is
does-
that in the same Tais where he talks about cooking?
I don't think so. I might be wrong. We can look it up. Okay, we'll look it up afterwards. Okay, I'm more afraid of you for next week. Don't worry. I'm not so worried about for this week. Next week I'm more afraid of you. Okay. I'm gonna dance around his tshuva next week. Okay, and then then there's also an example that we have of eating grains. I got to give you an example of cut up grains. Okay, of cut up grains, there is such a thing. It's not always. This is not always cut up. And next week we'll talk about examples of really cut up. There's something called frika, okay, and that is they harvest grains really early before they're fully ripened, and then they toast them, and then you cook them afterwards also, okay? And those often are sold cut up also, okay? So that would be an example of this case that the Gemara gives of cutting something into small pieces. Otherwise, it's pretty hard for us. Again, next week we'll talk about possible ideas. Okay, and one last thing I have to tell you, I was going to do something else, but we're not going to do that today. Fine. The two questions. One was the one he just mentioned: is what happens if you cook something instead of baking it? Like you deep fry it, like you make a donut. That's a machlokes we're not going to talk about today. The Rambam says we make mezonos on that. Shulchan Aruch says I don't know what you should do with it. It's a shayla, so it's better off not eating it, except if like in the middle of a meal of hamotzi. Excuse me, and then a different shayla. But what happens if you make a kedairah from not chameshes minadagam, like from rice or millet or other things like that? Mitzvah Hashem, we're going to talk about that one day also. Okay, so of these four brachos that I told you, usually the biggest questions, which is what we're going to talk about next time, is what's a kedairah? Okay, when do we say that it's mezonos and when do we say it's hadama? Okay, what makes it to be kedairah? The Gemara had these two examples, and Tosfos threw in another example of what makes something a kedairah. It's cut up. It's like a porridge, or it's like doesn't have tzuras pas, like it's pasta. But there are all kinds of other foods that we have what to talk about, which is when do they qualify to be kedairah in Mitzvah Hashem for next time.